Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Coffee, Buses, and Politics. It is shortly after 7:30 a.m., a very early time to discuss Cambridgeshire politics. And I'm here with David, with Stephen, and Martin again. Welcome back, Martin. People really liked the live stream for the election special last time. We got a lot of positive feedback. So, welcome back on the show to discuss a very interesting question that we often get asked in politics about democracy and the role of democracy. And the question for today, for everyone watching as well, and please do share your thoughts and your contributions, is democracy dying? So we're going to discuss different aspects of politics, trust in politics. Is trust declining? How do we regain that trust with our voters and in politics in general? The question of turnout that we discussed a bit last time in the context of the police and crime commissioner election, but of course it applies to other elections as well as in general, like to what extent people have knowledge about the political system, how can we inform better people who are voting in the UK about the role of politics and why they should be engaged. So thinking about this question about like trust in politics and the role of democracy, one of the things that's really interesting for me now, campaigning obviously in Huntington and like across the eastern region, is the number of people who are actually undecided on the doorstep. And it feels a bit different compared to 2019 and other elections. I mean, there are always people who are like, well, I don't really know much about politics, or I don't really care about politics, or I'm not really sure who I'm voting for. But I feel like in now this year campaigning, there's more and more of, well, I lost trust in politics. Like, look at the government. Like, how can this inspire trust? Like, why should I be involved? Nothing will really change. What can you, as a candidate, whether it's like local at the parish level, the town level, or indeed for the general, what can you actually change for me, given that things haven't really worked out for me in the last few years? So what do you think, David? Like, have we lost trust in politics in general?
Yeah, I think that I think there has been a loss of trust in politics. I think partly this is this. I mean, this goes back. I mean, for a few years, there's been quite a few problems in the UK, as I said, said before, since 2008 with the financial crisis, Brexit, COVID, inflation, all the rest of it. So there are substantive problems that the sort of system in the UK doesn't seem to be dealing with. I think more broadly across, if you like, the Western world, the industrial democracies, however you want to call it, there is a sort of feeling of secular decline, which doesn't help. But things aren't going in the right way. I think the other thing we've seen, and this is partly cause, partly symptom, is the rise of populism. Um, the and populism I mean is there's a guy called Cass Muda who's got a great definition of it, which is that populism is a kind of politics that in short says that there is a pure people and a corrupt elite that are necessarily opposed to each other. So you've seen that kind of politics, which says that everybody in power uh, is corrupt and doesn't have the interest of the people at heart. And there I will say that's not just political power, but sort of economic power as well as businesses and so on. So you've seen that rising in lots of places. It's not just a right wing phenomenon either. So you've seen left wing populists coming to power as well. So one of the problems is that it's saying that that kind of politics is saying that you've got that fundamental division, which I don't believe, and that things are worse than they are. There are problems, but that attitude does I think, or that viewpoint says they're worse than they are. But then the sort of the false hope that they offer um, it also worsens things. Now that there are structural problems with democracies. I mean, I we democracy is sort of flawed. We know there's issues with it and always needs work. But beyond that, there are particular problems at the moment. We know we've got rising inequality and so on, and people aren't able. And this isn't necessarily just a British phenomenon. And people aren't engaging with politics because they don't feel they can. but then the perception of that as well is also part of the problem. This is one of the things where perception becomes reality. If I can go back to the populism thing briefly, this is just one that I see quite a lot, is also people wanting to say things are simple when they're not. And then people say, oh, why can't we just do this? And sometimes it actually takes quite a long time to explain that actually things are quite complicated. Now, sometimes, particularly in the UK, we don't deal with the complicated situations very well, but it doesn't change the fact that they're complicated. So that's been a bit of a ramble, but I think I would say that the quality of democracy in the UK, but not just in the UK, has declined.
Yes, let me pick up on this, because you're saying about the quality of democracy declining, and I will put like a more or less controversial question to either Martin or Stephen, who wants to take it first. Is the quality of democracy, or is the perception of seemingly declining because the quality of our politicians is also declining in the UK? Or do you think there are other reasons? So I'm trying to link whether the people who are in politics or perceived to be in politics, whether that kind of impacts your engagement in that sense. What do you think?
So I think the Westminster lot did us a massive disservice over the last 15, 20 years. So since I'm not sure when the expenses scandal was, but I think that's when lots of people lost any respect for MPs. And of course, what's been going on recently with, the whole Boris Johnson not taking politics serious, Liz Truss thing hasn't really helped either. And so there's a perception that lots of politicians are corrupt or are making lots of money, which at a local level certainly isn't true. But I think so something I've heard, and my friend Brett Mickelberg from HTC always tells me, is so I think on average I must think about politics at least 7 minutes every hour. But the average person, he says, and I don't have any figures for this, thinks about politics for 7 minutes every year, which is about right, isn't it? And so and I'm always wanting to make complicated arguments about, like David said, the struggles of what we do, as well as celebrating the successes, because I think that's really important. But most of the people you talk to haven't put the effort into thinking about that and thinking about the big things we're trying to achieve. And I'm thinking, down to the earth things. It's like, improving Market Square. And so the amount of disinformation and the amount of casual thinking means you can't really convince these people intellectually, because they haven't put any of the background thought into it. And they basically just have very kind of populist, very simple views on how to fix things. I think that's a big issue as well. So I think that we've lost the hearts and souls of people. I grew up watching Question Time like most people, never put on TV anymore. So I think that's a big part of the problem.
Martin, what do you think about that? About I guess the perceived quality of politicians and trust in democracy in general?
Well, I as somebody that watches a lot of council meetings, and I watch a lot of parish meetings, and I watch a lot of district council meetings, I sometimes sit and watch some of the committee meetings and I despair. I have to say, overall, in Cambridgeshire, we're pretty good, actually. But I do absolutely despair at some of the stuff that I see. And that starts actually at parish level. But one of the big things for me is about how politicians behave. And this goes a long way towards it. So it goes back to sort of the populism thing. But politicians have lost the ability to lead a community. And to deliver a vision for a community. And what we increasingly get is politicians at every level campaigning against things and trying to stop things happen. But what they don't is lead a vision that shows what we want to happen. And I think we touched on this last time, but the congestion charging debate in Cambridge is a really, really good example, where all we heard through that debate, not all, but pretty much all we heard, was loud voices saying why it was a bad idea, and there was nobody driving the vision forward for what is going to happen. And I think there's that, and it's also the way councillors communicate sometimes as well. I get leaflets through my door from certain Fenland councillors, and what they're doing is talking down the combined authority, basically, without really having a conversation about the good stuff they're doing. Now, I'm not sure what good stuff they are doing, but I'd have a better idea if they told me, instead of just telling me, everything the combined authority isn't doing, when actually, the combined authority, the thing they talk down is the bus precept that Nick introduced. When actually, there's a positive thing to say about that, which is for the first time in probably a generation, we've got the ability to put money into and improve public transport. And that's a great positive story, but nobody is saying that. Everybody is saying we shouldn't have a bus precept. We shouldn't have a bus precept. And that tone from politicians undermines the system that they're working within.
Including Nick. I don't think Nick's could have done a good enough job selling it, is my honest opinion as well. And so we get to concentrate on negatives without enough. And it's the same with the congestion charge thing as well. It was all about congestion charges, and because the GCP were late getting the message out, we weren't talking enough about the benefits. And I think that debate was lost from the start. And it's a bit the same with bus precepts, I think.
I mean, Nick's got the benefit that as these improvements start to come through, he can actually show something, and it'll be something that a lot of people care about. It was when I was cabinet member for young people, the number one priority and the number one concern of young people was poor bus services. When you think that was going back to 2008, it sort of shows you that that'd be the same story today. Nothing's moved for 16 years. That's a frustration as well. And I think local politics suffers from the inability to do things.
I think what's really frustrating as well is like, and you hear this in the county council, for instance, like people like in the opposition, not everyone, but some people criticizing, let's say, the mayor's bus preset, saying, okay, that's an unfair tax. It's like, too much, or like, it shouldn't be there in the first place, or whatever the argument is. And then like when we're discussing within the communities committee, for instance, types of discussions, or like other cross-party discussions, transport always comes up, including raised by some of the same opposition councillors, as like one of the number one issues, as you say, Martin, especially for young people, but for everyone really who wants to access services, anything that's like outside their villages, and often those can be very isolated, especially in Huntingdonshire. And I'm like, well, like what is really frustrating for me in politics is, okay, if you don't agree with a certain solution, you can have many arguments why you can be against, let's say, a mayoral preset as a form of local taxation, but what is the other alternative? Because, okay, if we're not doing like, let's say, like a road user charge, if we're not doing a mayoral preset, if we're not doing like this other type of thing, if we don't want to put up, not that we can pay with the council tax on this, but if we don't want to put up council tax, if we don't want to do this and that, what else is left? Because ultimately, like all those services cost money. So like what is really frustrating for me in politics is the negative type of campaigning whereby you don't provide an alternative solution. It's like, okay, I disagree with this. I would fund it in a different way. And I think my way is better. And me as a campaigner, I'll persuade you that my way to fund, X bus services is better than the mayor's. But what all we hear, like mostly in literature, like, and this is true for other political parties as well, is like, no, this lot is doing it badly. We'll do it better, but not really telling me how you're going to do it when it is like a massive problem and everything costs money to deliver.
There's a phrase that I use quite a lot about modern politics, and I think this probably is quite this sums some of this up. But what it is that politics used to be about leadership, but increasingly it's about followship. Rather than lead a community, rather than the thing I did talk about last time, which is councillors understanding that they have a role to communicate about their council to their community, not just to act as a voice of their community in the council. And it's that sort of thing that councillors have to and MPs, by the way, because some of them are dreadful at it at the moment. There's one or two that are fantastic, are really good and trying to be positive, but some of them are dreadful. But it is about understanding that you are a community leader. You're not a community follower.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I see Stephen put a comment on here, so I'll read it from Simon saying politicians need to be authentic. This is why politicians like Donald Trump continue to get support. like I think actually I have mixed views on this, because I do see the appeal of someone, let's say someone who's not your typical politician, or that doesn't present themselves as such, or at least in the perception of that, to have more popular support. And like I'll ask Stephen how it works out for the independent. But on the other hand, I also see the flip side, because, for example, on the doorstep, not very often, but sometimes I do get like, oh yeah, like you don't really like, people, like sometimes some people are surprised, being like, oh, like you're a bit too young to be in politics, or like you don't really look like the typical person that you'd expect to be, standing for council or MP or whatever it might be. So I think it can go both ways. Do people actually want someone who is a bit different? Would it attract more popular support, or would that be like a change in a way it's a bit scary, like of not going with like a safe option of someone who presents themselves as someone who's like a typical, I don't know, career politician? What do you think, Stephen?
So I think part of my appeal, if I have one as a politician, is that because I'm independent, I don't have any peers around me to tell me how to do things, and so I'm kind of learning by myself and applying the skills that I learn in industry to politics and being a communicator, and kind of on that authenticity point and kind of also addressing what Martin just said. For me, my two big rules in politics were like, you should always celebrate your achievements, but you need to be honest about the obstacles as well, which means you also have to be prepared to do things which aren't popular. So in Huntingdonshire, that's the so-called green bin tax. Yeah, we've charged people £57 a year to have their green bin cleaned, because that puts our council, compared with almost all the other councils, on a firm financial footing, which allows me to carry out my objectives, which are usually around social justice and keeping people out of poverty. So things like the council tax support things like putting more money into disabled facilities grants, those are things we can afford to do because we took on popular decisions. And so, and that's kind of my ambition as a politician, is to try and be accountable for everything. And I sometimes get in trouble with my wife, who says not everything's your fault, but like I'm always really, really desperate to justify every decision we make, and I think that's part of it. And so that's kind of what I think authenticity means. But I don't think enough people do that, and increasingly I think that politicians shy away from social media and shy away from the public spotlight because they don't like scrutiny. If there's no scrutiny, then it's an easy job, isn't it? But I actually think the reverse is that scrutiny helps me to formulate my opinions and make sure I always do the best thing.
I mean, yes, but I mean, there is also an issue that one of the reasons people don't want scrutiny is sometimes because it's a pain in the arse, and sometimes it says something untoward. But also, a lot of the time, it's just people are quite unpleasant. Are we, blunt about it? Yeah. There's, and that's quite difficult to deal with. There's, that does have an impact. For instance, it's very easy to find out, for instance, your local councillor's address. Yeah. Or if you run for election, find out their address. And people say, "Oh, I wanted to be a local councillor. Why hasn't this person put their address?" And it's like, well, why do you think there are? You get quite a lot of abuse online anyway. It's not entirely unreasonable to say, "Oh, actually, I'm a little bit worried about this. I don't need the hassle."
So 4 years ago today, I was elected mayor of St Neots, and I thought it was fantastic. And that weekend, I shared a Facebook memory about it. That weekend, I got such horrendous abuse. People calling me a paedophile, people calling me racist, people calling me ableist, which was just complete nonsense. And so that weekend was really difficult because I've got quite thick skin, but my family don't. And we have had incidences with people turning up at the front door and intimidating my wife while I wasn't there, and those kind of things, and that's horrible. And also, like this week, the mayorship in St Neots changed hands, and Rob Simonis, who I think is an excellent mayor, not a controversial figure at all, very mild-mannered. His first 3 months, he was all over social media, and then he got so much abuse about a decision to criticize a shop in the high street that wasn't really up to standard, that he basically quit social media because of it. And I think you see that increasingly. So definitely that's a problem, and that kind of reads into the whole people not respecting politicians anymore and thinking that all politicians are the same, which is a weird trope.
And the thing is, it's a difficult cycle to break out of because the two things feed off each other.
I mean, I agree with that. And just going back to the point that Simon put on, by the way, I don't think Trump is authentic, by the way, but I'm not going to go down that route, by the way. But apart from that, what he says is absolutely right. But you can imagine how many times I've been told I don't look like a typical Tory, by the way.
It's because you've got a beard, and so this is why Alex needs to up her game. But if you go far enough down her Twitter feed, you will find some tweets when she used to have a beard.
A fake TikTok filter, just to clarify for the
I
public.
didn't realise it was fake.
There is a big thing about the way politicians are portrayed as well, by the way, which is about how the media work with politicians and deal with politicians. And one of the things about I had, not very often, but once or twice had people turn up on my doorstep as well when I was a councillor. One incident that was particularly unpleasant, but the media and the media's liking for doorstepping, it encourages the behaviour. There's no two ways about it. You know, every time a politician's in trouble, they're doorstepping him. And it makes absolutely no difference to the story that they get to see the guy saying nothing and diving into a cab or a car, you know, at 8 o'clock in the morning. But they insist on doing it. And so when they complain about local people going out and campaigning outside MPs' doors and campaigning outside politicians' doors and things like that, well, actually, they need to look at themselves and stop doorstepping politicians completely, and that might encourage it. That might send a message. But it's also true that the media's, especially the national media, and the way they look to create the next sensation, or to and they're constantly seeking the next political sensation, and they spend a lot of the time doing that, rather than having genuine conversations about the good and bad of politics and political decisions. You know, and that that doesn't help either, because that feeds into the feeling of frustration that people have. Also, it feeds into the feeling people have about politicians. It feeds that story.
Yeah, on the social media as well, just to bring it back to the topic of like abusive comments or just simply nasty, insulting comments on social media. I don't think it's only like kind of putting off people who are already involved in politics, like Stephen said, like maybe closing their social media accounts, or not being as active, or not being as proactive, sharing what they're doing in the council or whatever it is on like local groups and communities. I think it's also putting off other people, because if I open, let's say, I'm not sure, like, you know, what example to give. I put a canvassing tweet out there, and I have like a stream of like constant like nasty comments underneath it, and this happens to people like across all parties now. Like, there's, especially on Twitter, it's like getting worse and worse. But then if I'm like just a random member of the public who is like, you know, perhaps I don't really care about politics, but I see that popping up, it's like, oh, let me look at the comments, and I just see like people being insulting and being like abusive. Like, that puts me off as well as a voter or as someone who wants to know more about politics. So I think it has this like this group effect, as well as like obviously making the politician feel a bit uncomfortable, but it's making people who are more passive consumers of social media, who are not the people commenting or going out there to putting their views, who are just reading, you know, scrolling on Twitter, on Instagram, and they're like, why should I be involved in this? Like, people are just like insulting and like they're like attacking each other, and like, I don't want to play a part in this. I just want to, like, you know, mind my own business and have a nice life.
But go on, Martin.
Yeah, there's another point about social media and the interaction of politicians as well, and I think it's really important, and it's one that I would beg every elected politician to think about and understand. And you know, this is from somebody that does public consultation for a living. What you hear from, and what you hear from are is one side of an argument. And the people have a view that because you've only heard from that one side of the argument, that's what matters, that's what counts, that's the only opinion you should listen to. But actually, the reality is that the majority of the time, those people that are in favour or supportive of something don't say anything. And so, you know, what you get is the wrong end of things. And you have to always bear in mind you are only hearing that side of the argument, and understand that there are a lot of people sat at home that see differently and understand it differently. And how you get those people to make their voices known, that's another matter. But it is absolutely genuine that people that don't want something are the ones that will come out and shout.
That's really interesting, because I was thinking about, even after I was involved in politics, even after I was elected on the council, let alone before, when I was like a non-voter, I get all those letters, of course, about this development or this other consultation. And I have to say, and I admit here on the live stream, I never complete them, usually because they catch me in the middle of like me being at work or in between two meetings. And I'm like, yeah, I'm fine with that. Or like, I don't really care like about, those houses being built there, like whatever. But and I think it's just psychologically, if you actually have a strong negative reaction to something, you will find the time. I will stop and I'll be late to my meeting and express my view on social media because I'm angry about this. Whereas if I'm like, I don't really care either way, or like, I'm like, slightly positive, I'm like, no, I'll just like, continue with my work. This can wait. Or like, I don't have to like fill this consultation in. And I saw this it happened to me, because some of my friends were like, oh, so you didn't really fill in this consultation, this other thing. It's like, oh yeah, I forgot about it. I didn't have time. It was just not on my priority list. And I thought, like, if I don't do this as someone who is in politics in my local area, like, how can we expect people to have like more, to have young people involved in consultations, or to have like people we have to like lead by example as well, I think.
There was an FOI thing, wasn't there, a council this last couple of months, where the county council's been forced to reveal the identities of some councillors who responded to a consultation.
Me as well.
I'm thinking like,
I'm happy to say I shared
that wasn't me. That wasn't me.
My residents' group comments.
I don't think it's our role to fill those things. I think those are things for residents mostly, and it's for us to act on them as well. So I always feel a bit two-minded about having to fill in a consultation, because what I want to do is I want to listen to residents through the consultation and not necessarily influence the outcomes by putting my views in up front. So part of our role, I think, is sitting back and waiting for the consultations to complete and then trying to interpret the data. So I don't feel too bad about not being a filler in of consultations either.
Well, as a counselor, I do, but it's always on behalf. So like, for example, when we have those consultations, I say like, well, I want to submit some anonymized comments, or like, I agree with the residents or the residents association. I kind of submit it as an email, and that's exactly in the freedom of information request. So like, there is one which I actually like, would, if you have someone with personal information, you have to go back and say, is it okay for this to be shared? Because they're not my words. It's me saying my resident said this to me, and as the county council, I want to represent those views, because perhaps they don't want to represent them directly, and my role is as well to kind of represent those views indirectly in that way. But yeah, I was speaking as a resident of, just being consulted on something that happens very locally. And I think it's so difficult to like get more people engaged in that kind of thing, because unless you're like feeling very strongly against, it is so difficult, as Martin said, to engage the public, who are, especially people who live. Another big thing for me is because I live until like, I hopefully will move in the summer, but I always lived in private rent, and I always like moved from one place to another. And for me, it's like, well, I'm moving out of here like in 6 months anyway, like why should I have a say? Like, or maybe I'm not here long term, or maybe I have to change my rent. And there's so many, when you speak about consultations and developments and so on, well, we need more young voices. Well, in Cambridge City in particular, but also in other, towns and villages everywhere, like we're more likely to be in private rent and like shorter term in places. And you have this sense that like, oh, I don't really have that much of a say. Whereas someone who has been in the area for 20 years, owns their home, is more likely to be engaged, more likely to vote, more likely to feel they have a stake. Of like, I have to comment on this, development proposal because I've been living here for 20 years. Whereas, someone like me will be like, well, I've only been here for 2 months and I might move next year if the rent goes up. So like, I feel like I don't really want to have a say on those houses being built over here. So that's like a very challenging thing about like transient populations and people who like move quite frequently, and how do we engage them in politics and in voting in general. Yeah. What do you think, like David? Like, do you get, because I think in like Huntington North, in your like town area as well, like we do get a lot of that as well, like people who like moved recently, or people who are like in like less kind of like stable accommodation, and like how people feel about democracy is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean it's difficult. Also, you don't have the time. You've got loads of other things you're having to deal with, and that that on top. And also a lot, I mean, to be honest, I think we need to rethink how we do consultations generally. But I think there's an issue with consultations that people say a lot, oh, they don't listen to the consultations anyway. Now, I don't think that's true. I mean, you know, I think there's this assumption that, or, you know, the thought, you know, not quite this deliberately, but people say, oh, I didn't get what I wanted from the consultation, and so therefore it was a whitewash. I think that's a problem, and I think there's like, we don't make it clear what consultations are for. But then we always do them, basically they're online, and a few are in person, are sort of posted or whatever. And I'm not sure how well, you know, there just seems to be problems like, do we almost have consultation overload? Because there seem to be a lot of consultations about different things.
And we don't do a good enough job of reporting back the outcomes quite often as well, so people don't see. I mean, not true with the GCP one, I think, but in general, people put their effort in, because it's always a big effort, isn't it, to respond to a consultation, and then don't get, well, especially if they don't agree with the result, or don't get a good enough summary of the responses sometimes.
But and also sometimes, to be honest, consultations are not robustly done. You know, sometimes, frankly, I think people are putting a finger on the scale to get the answer they want. But sometimes consultations are just not very well written, and you know, the you know, just from you know, interpreting them is impossible, is make things difficult. But going back to it, if you're insecure housing, you've got 2 or 3 kids, you've just come back from work and you've got to get tea on, I'm not sure that the first thing on your mind is going to be filling out a form, to be blunt. I mean, and I think this is somewhere where councillors ideally would be doing that and saying, look, this is what my patch thinks. But it's that is difficult as well.
Yeah, I mean that point about this is what my patch thinks is really important, because actually it's not what your patch thinks, it's what the patch, the percentage of your patch that have chosen to comment thinks. That's part of what I was saying earlier on. The point about IT, I think is really important. You know, with the stuff I do with consultation, we increasingly try and do things online, rather than do, as an example, a public consultation in a village hall, because the village hall ones just don't work. And you know, you can get a much more honest conversation online, or by pointing people to an online survey where they can fill it out at their convenience, rather than have to go out for 2 hours to go to a village hall to listen to a lot of people shout. Don't really shout, but they do get quite angry. So, you know, there's that side of it, but there's also, you know, I'd say this from my perspective, trying to get and do an honest conversation to get genuine feedback from people is really, really difficult, because actually what you're trying to do is try and separate those few people that are positive and have positive things to say, whilst being defensive and not putting questions out there that are just going to give you an onslaught of abuse and no's. And it's really, really tough.
This question comes from Neil our friend Neil in Fenland, not from me as well. So Neil's one of our loyalist viewers, and so he's put the question in.
So is this the question on the screen?
Yeah. Can we use IT more? Because I mean that's how I, you know, listen. You do a lot of door knocking, Alex.
Yeah.
In your ward, I spend far too much time on social media, communicating what we're doing, talking about the problems, and actually debating with people. It's kind of where I came from, and I think that gives me a good feeling. You know, acknowledging Martin's point about and your point about usually it's lots of negative voices quite often, but debating those things and basically performing for the gallery sometimes, the people who don't have the strong opinions. Quite often when I go out in town on a Saturday, people come and say, I agree with you, and they won't say it on social media. So for me, social media is an important way of me understanding if what I'm doing or what I intend to do is the right thing.
I think like things like this as well, where like, people just speak about issues like we do a coffee bus and politics without having a script. I think also one of the issues in politics is you imagine politicians always reading, like, and of course like parties have their party lines, let's not like, lie about that, but like just people being able to freely discuss a topic. And that's why I like the doorstep conversations, because on the doorstep, like I can ask, oh, what are the local issues that interest you? And anything can come up, and I have to have a response to that, or at least like a certain view on that, or like respond in some way. Whereas if you just do the pre-scripted video and like the nice kind of like just leaflet and political material, everything seems not genuine in a way, because it is prepared. It is like a prepared piece of communication. And I think like things like social media, obviously commenting, like having podcasts like this could be quite important. But I want to say as well something about the in-person consultations, because I do agree with Martin. Often those village hall or like community center meetings where you go there and most people already made up their minds and will be like mostly against a certain proposal, because that's why you are more likely to show up. I also think this is very difficult for voices that are of a different view, or just simply undecided to say anything, or just people who are not used to the political structures. So I remember like going to something before I was in politics, just being curious, and I'm not someone who expresses my view first or puts my hand up first in the meeting, and you get a lot of people being very passionate about something, and you feel like, well, after I heard all this, I'm not afraid, but like I feel uncomfortable to actually say something that's different, or say something that like actually I don't care about this as much as all the people who clearly care about this have said. And it is a very challenging position for like this, what Dan says in the comments, the silent majority, to be like, well, actually I think differently, or actually this issue doesn't concern me, I'm concerned about another thing instead. So it's like very difficult.
So I mean, there's an important point on it, and sometimes one of the things that I mean what you say is absolutely right. We very often, if I do a public exhibition in a village hall as an example, what I very often get is somebody taking me to one side and saying, I can't say this with everybody else around. Yeah. I think this is really good. And all I say to people is, please put it on a feedback form. Just make sure you do something, so that we can see it. But we get that all the time. And, I've had it as a bizarre one on social media. So one of the things we discussed amongst ourselves a bit on Twitter, or there was a discussion, was about my love of Kiss, and the greatest rock and roll band that ever walked the planet, by the way. And actually I belong to a couple of Kiss forums, and on one of them, when I was a councillor and a Conservative councillor at election time, I just used to get immense grief from a couple of people that are really strong socialists, and left of centre socialists, and really some of it quite serious abuse. And nobody would say anything or whatever, and me being me, I stick up for myself. But then when you go off and meet somebody at a gig or whatever that that's part of that forum, they'll say, well, I'm with you. You say, I'm voting Conservative, I can't tell anybody, but I am. And I used to get that a lot as well, and I'm sure in some areas and in a certain time going forwards, there will be that same sense about the Labour Party after they've won the election, because that's the way the trend goes. It shouldn't be. We should have honest debate and good debate, and understand that just because somebody is different to you doesn't make them wrong necessarily. It doesn't make them a bad person. It just makes them different.
However, thinking that Kiss is the greatest rock and roll band of all time does make you a bad person, Martin.
I'm going to take a couple more. I think there's an interesting comment here, two interesting questions before we, apart from that comment, before we finish, like in 10 minutes or so. Like I have this one that's really interesting, is about the differences of do you think this this lack of trust or like democracy is dying is an English problem? I suspect Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales is more engaged in politics. I actually don't know like how the voter registration or turnout figures look like. I've never really studied in depth politics in devolved governments. Do you have any views, like David, Stephen, Martin, on this one?
So
Don't know about it.
this is entirely anecdotal.
Mm.
My uncle is in Cardiff and was the leader of the Labour group on the city council.
Mm.
My aunt is a Lib Dem in North Wales, and I don't think it is necessarily more engaged. And I think it just talking to them is completely anecdotal, I know, but it can be, and the for instance, the thing at the moment is the 20 mile an hour. There is a discussion to be had there, but it's the discussion that seems to be speaking to them as sort of shallow and thin and not engaging with the issues as elsewhere. But this is also not a new thing. I mean, thinking about just talking to and in case he's watching, Bodidar Greg, but this has been a thing with developments in Cardiff for years. My uncle Greg was particularly involved in the arts, still is, but in some artistic commissions, which have proved in the end, actually proved very popular in Cardiff and around Cardiff Bay. But the grief about why are you wasting this money? Yeah.
I mean, the Northern Ireland thing, 100% Northern Ireland politics is horrible.
Yeah.
Everything I see of it, and I always keep an eye on Northern Ireland just because of my sort of military background and military history and that. And Northern Ireland politics is horrible, and the sooner it gets away from the connection between religion and how you vote, the better, and the better the people of Northern Ireland will be. But the reality is everything for me is it's just a broken system.
Just to say as well that there's like this, I mean, it kind of links to this comment about like how can we engage people in politics. And I see there's some comments on the electoral system again, and I think we have to do a session on like the different ways of voting and different electoral systems, not for today, not in the last few minutes, but I think as a general question, it's like a good one to end the discussion on for today. How can we engage more young people, those who say, and I'll put it like regardless of age, those who say I'm not interested in politics, because I don't think it's an age thing. Like surely, like of course the turnout is lower in the younger population than, let's say, if you compare it to over 65s. Like if you look at postal votes, there's like a massive difference there. People who are more likely to vote postal, they're more likely to show up to vote, well, to turn out to vote, to actually cast their vote in the election and so on. But I think it's like a question for everyone. I think regardless of your age, we see more and more people who are like, well, I don't trust politicians, I'm not interested in politics, I actually have no idea who I'm voting for because they're all the same. So how can we engage more people in the political process?
Let 16-year-olds vote would be a start, wouldn't it? And give them more franchise. I think that would more agency. That would definitely improve things. I do meet a lot of young people who are interested in politics, but don't think they have any real voice. I think that single change would introduce almost not entire generation, but would get people involved earlier and think that they have more of a role, especially when they're still in education, most of them.
I actually think the 16-year-old thing, it's a weird thing to say. I think it would be fantastic for the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party increasingly are chasing an older vote. And it's a disappearing vote, and making 16-year-olds and allowing 16-year-olds to vote would really, really focus the Conservative Party's mind.
Just changed my mind then, Martin. I'd make it 32.
I'm not saying the Conservative Party would benefit, because there is and it is true that people drift towards conservatism as they get older. But the reality is the Conservative Party desperately need to be relevant to younger people, and force. One of the only ways of doing it might be to force them.
I think this conversation around like age and what should be the voting age, and like generally I'm quite like pro like electoral reform in general. Like I think like everyone who pays council tax should have a say on their local councillor. Like I think like I have a lot of progressive policies in terms of like electoral reform. However, I think like, is this like the actual issue we're trying to address? Because whether it's 16 or 18, I think for me the main issue is around the information. I think it's like, because we have to have like a generation, I guess, when you leave school or you're like close to leaving school and you already have an understanding of the political system, of like who makes decisions on what. And I know some schools do this very well, but I don't think like it's true to say that everyone lives with this understanding. Definitely, I mean, I didn't do school in the UK, but it wasn't the case for me. Like I had no idea when I was 18, like, you know, who the local council is, who does decisions on what, who decides on like, you know, like basic things that affect me in my everyday life. So like it's very difficult, because then if I start from that point, like me at 18 having no idea about how politics works, then it's very easy to be a non-voter like I was, because I'm like, well, I have no idea about this, I don't know how it works, I don't have time, I have to go to work, whatever. Like I'm not like, unless I study the politics, like I don't have time to engage in it. And I think that's where we need to put more effort, because if we get people interested and knowledgeable early on, you know, when they're teenagers, then you're more likely to actually, you know, register to vote when you're 18. And actually, when you register, you actually go and vote in your very first election, and it will make a massive difference. Because if you wait until you're like 30 to vote for the first time, like many of my friends did, then it's very difficult to kind of get engaged into like the habit of, you know, voting regularly and so on. What do you think, David, Martin, Stephen?
I think part of the problem here is the last word, politics, and what people mean by politics. I had a piece in the Hunts Post ages ago about whether people are politicians. And it's like, if you're, you know, and I know this is trite and it comes out, but politics is the environment and buses and parks and the health service, and you know, it is everything. You know, it's. But when we say politics, we think of the way the press covers things. So you think of the sort of coverage of electoral politics.
Yeah.
And you know, not what people are doing. So if you like, just take an example off the top of my head, Diamond Hampers in Huntingdon is a political organisation. It's not a party political organisation. They're not interested particularly in electoral politics, but they're there providing services and help to people who are really struggling through, you know, the pantry and the attic. That strikes me as pretty explicitly political.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's not party political, it's not electoral politics, but that is something that's political. And you see that saying, oh, I'm not interested in politics. I mean, okay, I'm you know, I very much am, always have been. Maybe I'm missing something here and I'm not communicating effectively. But if you complain about the potholes in the roads, that is a political statement.
Yeah.
And it's sort of getting people to say, well, you know, one of the ways you deal with things like that is electoral. Is electoral. It's not the only way to do it. I mean, what was Ronald Reagan's line? An activist isn't somebody who tells me that the river is dirty. It's someone who cleans the river. There is a certain, you know, there is a certain something to that. There are people who get, you know, who are getting on with things. But I think it's the way we you know, I get at election time that you're going to cover the horse race a bit, but then the way we cover politics a lot of the time is the sort of, in, you know, and I'm thinking national politics in the news, is this ridiculous soap opera stuff. And that's a problem. But then, and I think one of the other things to go back to was, you know, go right back to the start, and maybe it's a subject for another time, is local media.
Mm-hmm.
In the, I mean, the BBC local radio has been gutted.
Yeah.
A lot of places don't have you know, you used to have multiple newspapers covering the local areas. Now you don't. And they're under huge pressure as well. I mean, it's difficult to get, you know, to get somebody to go to local council meetings. Made a bit easier when they're streamed online, but there are, for instance, you know, right at the bottom level, there are some decisions that the Huntingdon Town Council has made where, okay, a few councillors have talked about them online on social media and whatever, but which I think are quite important, and they haven't really got a huge amount of coverage, and people aren't aware of them. So I think that you know, that is an issue as well.
Yeah, I just to follow up on that, and I would say this to councillors to have a think about, and certainly the bigger councils should be able to do this on their own, but you know, through the comms departments. But if you're trying to publicise something you've done, don't just put out a press release. Put out a press release and follow it up with a phone call to the journalist. You know, and that's the way you'll get your story there. But there's something in all of this that I think we sort of haven't covered, and it's not about PR, but it is about making politics more relevant and devolution, and making councils in a position where they can genuinely enact change, rather than what they increasingly are, which is an agency of government. And you know, you go back to the potholes argument is a great one. Everybody everywhere across the country is complaining to their local council about potholes.
Yeah.
Now, when you think about how local council's funded, you know, and the fact that the majority of their funding comes from government, and since 2010 that funding has been absolutely destroyed, and the fact that everywhere is complaining about potholes makes you think actually the problem might not be the local council. And if the more relevant you make local authorities, and the more you enable them to make change and deliver change and deliver improvement, the more people will find it and believe it to be relevant.
And can I add something on that? This is something that I think is quite important. Local councils have to be able to get it wrong, and you know, do something and then be kicked out. Yeah.
Sorry, there's a thing about local councils and the fact that yes, councils will get it wrong. You know, have to be allowed to get it wrong. Sorry for interrupting, David. Absolutely right. But it's also, when councils are able to try new things and do new things, that's something that benefits every other council. And an objective discussion about it is something that helps that. You know, a great example for me is South Cambs and their 4-day week. You know, there needs to be a sensible discussion about that 4-day week and what it actually means. And what it's turned into is a political bun fight. Yes and no. And actually what needs to happen is a genuine, open-minded look at everything that's about, to see, is it relevant, and does it stay relevant if and when that expands across councils across the country. That's the debate. It's not right or wrong. It's what can we learn from it.
Yeah.
I'll take more quick. Sorry,
this point on the screen. Sorry, because I last night I was at this debate, and this was a big thing that came up, is that we don't teach politics anymore. Most people don't understand how government works, how local government works, what parliamentary sovereignty is as well. So Anthony Carpin, who you all know from Twitter, who's the most prolific tweeter around here as well, and also kind of a moral conscience for all of us, stood up and made this point, is that most people don't understand how local government works. I went to one of his kind of half-day crash courses and taught me an amazing amount, even though I've been involved for the last 6 years, about how local democracy works around here. So more education, I think, is another way of getting younger people involved and interested, because, you know, even from inside, the whole thing is completely perplexing, isn't it, most of the time?
Yeah, I think you just have to start with the issues that, like, as it was said before, people are interested in, because I think, like, yes, there, you know, political education does exist, but it's always about, like, from a theoretical point of view. And I did this, like, a bit in university, like I did this a bit, like, not in school to any kind of shape or form, really. But in university, it's like, okay, how does this actually affect me? Because unless you're interested in politics as a topic, as an academic topic, it's very difficult to see. So I think you have to start from, like, the issues that people are interested in. Like, let's say I want more, like, space, youth community center space to, like, meet up with my friends, because there are very few spaces around where you don't have to pay money to go and hang out with your friends. How does this youth center provision, how is this affected by the local council? Like, how can I contact my counselor about this? How can I, like, you know, how those facilities that I use as a young person are funded, for example, rather than, like, okay, here's the Westminster model and here's the difference between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Because the reality is, like, and this includes myself, like, I'm not so interested in, like, people shouting at PMQs or, like, you know, the latest scandal of this or the other MP. I'm interested about, like, what pragmatic difference I can make locally, and how can I be responsive and accountable to people, like, like in my local area, the town that I live in, and the wider constituency. And I think if you kind of start from that local level, you have a very different response to politicians and politics, rather than like the kind of more media hype scandal type politics.
But the point I would make about that is absolutely right. But this is about being honest conversations, that schools can't do everything, and increasingly schools are exam machines. And the more we understand and think about, and if we ever think about what's the role of schools, and my view about schools is schools are there to provide an educational uplift to young people, so that they join society as a productive member. And if you think about those things a little bit more, and then have a rethink about, everybody wants everything to be in the school curriculum, and the school curriculum can't cope with it because it's too busy pushing people through exams. And so there's a thought about that.
So next time about schools, then, like the next live stream, it will be about schools.
I can talk about my views on education forever. By the way, it's fundamental to One Nationism is getting education right. But there's a comment from Sue Foster about about youth. It's that comment there. There's a point about music, rock against racism, and all that stuff. It's really important. Modern music is absolute pap, in my view. And the reality for me is we need a sort of a punk rock revival, something that really excites young people, that is overtly political in music. And again, it's about media. They need to push and push to make sure that we stop the way that media push rock stars because they look nice and they've got a reasonable voice, and really allow some aggressive, challenging music to come out, because it's fantastic for young people.
So I was actually just thinking, who are political artists at the moment? You've got, to an extent, you've got Little Sims. And you do have some within rap music and so on. Drill is responding to political issues to an extent, but you don't have the Jam.
Well, we have about
Billy Bragg.
600 people watching, so please do let us know in the comments. I'm just aware it's like past 8. Some of us need to go to work at 9 a.m. today, unfortunately or fortunately, or it's fortunately for me, because like I'm very glad to be in work. But I just want to share one last comment. And my simple answer is yes. I don't think it's about 2017 or whenever it was. I think in general, like, we need more of the online presence, and there are different messages that appeal to different audiences. So this one is asking, like, would using memes or other things online make people more likely to be engaged in politics? Of course, there are things that are inappropriate and appropriate to use in campaigning, but I think in general, having like a diversity of types of messaging, having like politicians engage on different platforms, like this one, would actually help engage people in democracy. But I'm just surprised that at this early hour, not early anymore, it's almost 9 a.m. We have about almost 600 people watching this live stream. So just want to thank everyone so much for listening in and for your comments. And a lot of you have been very engaged this morning with your comments and questions as well. So
you said earlier that we don't have a script. I think that's dishonest, because we spend all night preparing our
I woke up 5 minutes before
we didn't even have a topic. At 7:29 we didn't have a topic this morning as well. Next week we do have a topic, though, because next week we're supposed to have National Highways this week, but Paul Salmon, it was his wife's birthday, which I think is probably a legitimate excuse, but Paul's going to come in next Friday to talk about A421, A14. David's got some local highways concerns as well. So we've talked about trains, we've talked about buses, so next week we're going to talk about cars for a change.
That would be great. I'm really looking forward. I have so many questions on the A14 and the junctions on the A14. I cannot wait for National Highways to answer them.
So anybody who's watching, get your questions ready ahead of time and maybe post them on our social media, and we can probably give Paul a bit of preparation, because I'm sure he doesn't know the whole of the Highways network, but he's really good. And he turned up at a parish council meeting with me a couple of weeks ago, got a really hard time, and a fairly hard time from one of my residents, but dealt with it really well. So he's a top guy.
I worked with National Highways on the A14 upgrade when I was leader, and I thought actually with that they were excellent.
Well, thank you so much, David, Stephen, Martin, for your contributions today. It's been like a very, very rich and interesting debate as always on this issue of trust in politics, and looking forward to next week. So like Stephen, 7:30 a.m. again on Friday.
It's in his calendar,
with National Highways, same time, early in the morning. Do prepare your highways questions for the National Highways representative, and we'll try to do an interactive session as always, answering your questions on this. So thank you. 600 now, yes, 600 people now for watching, and have a lovely
Switch it off quick before it goes down.
Yes. It's a nice comment from Simon. Thank you, Simon. So it's 602 people now. So it's only going up. Things can only get better, Stephen. I say this all the time. So have a good Friday and weekend, everyone, and see you on Friday next week at 7:30 a.m. Thank you all.
Bye.
Good day.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.